Hey everyone, patch 26.0.4 just dropped, and most of the changes are pretty in line with what the community predicted, which is surprising. I expected us all to be comically wrong about things. And I'm also a bit worried, because when I was predicting what the changes might be, I didn't think they'd be a big enough impact on the meta. So let's hope that I'm wrong about how impactful these changes will be, and let's go through and see what all the changes were. First, finally, we have a changed Death Knight Discover mechanics. 3 rune cards are gone now. The full list of 3 rune cards is Alexandra's Mograine and Soul Stealer and Vampiric Blood for Blood. It's Frostworm's Fury, Mara Manipulator, and Lady Death Whisper for Frost. And for Unholy, it's Grave Strength, Lord Marogar, and Plagued Grain. So those are good cards, and they're definitely some of the most problematic things to be discovered, right? Getting additional Mograines could determine the blood matchup. Vampiric Blood was really unfun to see discovered as an aggro deck. Soul Stealer was honestly not that problematic compared to the other two. Frostworm's Fury and Mirror Manipulator were cards where discovering them often just won you the game when you didn't have them before. And when you picked Lady Death Whisper, it was really just picking Frostworm's Fury with extra steps, right? And for Unholy, Grave Strength is nice to see gone. It's too much volatile damage to be able to discover that. Plagued Grain is not a big deal. It's the clear outlier in this list of cards. It doesn't matter at all that it's removed, and is generally a buff to discover effects. Lord Marogar is actually sort of funny because it's a Countess nerf, because if you've ever seen Countess generate a Lord Marogar, you know how disgusting that is, and that's no longer possible. It's also no longer possible to use Amalgam to discover Lord Marogar, which is a huge hit to the power level of Amalgam and Undead decks in general, and that's really, really nice, because Lord Marogar is the sort of thing that you should not be getting extra copies of. That card is disgustingly strong. So, seeing those 9 cards get removed from the discovery pools is nice, but it also means that when you're discovering cards, you're more likely to see a Patchwork, you're more likely to see a Blood Boil, more likely to see just a Burn spell. So it's not clearly unambiguously a nerf, and it remains to be seen just how much impact it'll have. It does fix the most disgusting high rolls, where they discover life gain to survive. They discover freeze to stall out until Soul Stealer's at the board. They discover burst that should never be available in their class with Grave Strength, or in their runes at least. So it definitely is a good band-aid. It's the only change that I could think of that didn't just actually inadvertently buff Discover, but it still has a little bit of that lingering, and I'm not quite sure it's unambiguously a nerf. It should still be an improvement though, because with a Mograine, a Vampiric Blood, Frostworm's Fury out of the Discover pool, I think the buffs it does receive are less important than those nerfs. Next up, we have Rowdy Fan down from +4 to +3 attack, which is the nerf I expected to see. In Setheno combo decks, it probably still gets played, and aggro decks, it might still get played. It's pretty close to being the 30th card at this point, but it was a card that was seeing play in all the most powerful aggressive decks, so it's good to see it getting nerfed. Overseer for Judara's nerf is the loss of 2 attack, which is largely irrelevant in my opinion. Like, it still is nerfed, the card is weaker, but realistically, you're playing it to get a mid-sized body and draw Frostworm's Fury, and it still does all of those things. I think it's very unlikely to see the Overseer for Judara nerf actually affecting anything. Trick of the World Tree has been gutted for you Wild players. It now refreshes mana crystals instead of granting 10. That's going to be a tremendously different card, and essentially it's just been banned. The old Trick of the World Tree is just dead, and that combo does nothing. And then we get on to buffs. Rockmaster Boone is just straight up down to 3 mana, because putting this guy at 4 mana is ludicrous, and at 3 mana he's just fine. He's not even overpowered. I have no idea why he came out not at 3 mana. Warriors also added a couple of other flat 1 mana buffs. Burst Riff is down from 2 to 1, and Bridge Riff is down from 6 to 5. They both desperately needed it, especially Burst Riff. This card was insanely undertuned. I will note that Bridge Riff actually felt kind of alright at 6 mana. At 5 it should be very strong. The big issue with Bridge Riff on 6 is it means your Synergy Riff is going to be coming down on turn 7, and that's just too slow. They also got a buff to Power Slider, getting a flat +1/+1. I was actually expecting it to stay at a 3 mana 1/3. At a 3 mana 2/3, it's very, very easy to get this thing doing relevant trades very early in the game. This is just an unambiguously good card now. Shield Block down to 2 mana. Some people thought it might be Arcane Intellect with Armor, which would have been sick, but it looks like it's going the route of just being a 2 mana card that's incredible. Frightened Flunky is going to be going up to 3 health, because I mean, 2 health taunts for 2 mana is just like not a thing. That's so easy to kill by so many things that trade it with better effects than discover a taunt minion, so it needed to go up to 3 health. Thori'Belore will now actually rise like the Phoenix from the Ashes, instead of rising like the Phoenix from the Ashes for a little while before it actually dies, which was always the thing that weirded me out. And with the number of fire spells in the game for Warrior right now, it's not even that big of a buff, so this is just, like, it's a better card now, but mostly the text has just been cleaned up, because I don't think it really affects Thori'Belore in terms of how the card gets played at the minute. The buffs to a Thori'Belore deck are really the other things that are being buffed for Warrior, not this. Infinite has the Magnitude now reduces the cost of the spells it discovers by 1. It definitely needs the change, because it's just such an inefficient card that every time you play it, you're losing so much tempo. Effectively, it's 1 mana now, but it's backloaded. What it is the complete opposite of Overload. However, I do think it needed this buff. I wouldn't be surprised if it had been buffed down to 1 mana. It's a fairly similar change. It might just be a play pattern thing, where this being at 1 mana is actually hard to trigger the finale, or harder to trigger the finale than it is at 2 mana. I'm happy to see this buff. I don't think it's to make Infinitize Max dude crazy at all, but I do think it's to make the card feel a lot less terrible to experiment with. Audio Splitter has been reimagined as a 2 mana 3/2 minion, which Mech Mage desperately needed more 2-drop, so I'm happy to see that change. Spitelash Sirens had its old buff reverted. I wasn't around at the time. I was just like, wow, what is this card I've never seen before? But apparently this is a real playable card now, unlike the 5 mana version that was far too slow for its effect. So I'm interested in seeing what sort of degenerate stuff Naga Mage is that caused Spitelash to get nerfed in the first place. Arcane Artificer is up to 3 health. Not a surprise, it's a defensive 1-drop. At 2 health it was pretty frail. Stranglethorn Heart's down to 8 mana. That doesn't really make the card much better, because on 8 mana, how many of your beasts have really died? But I guess if you really need 1 Banjo Sar for 8, you can still do it. It's not terrible, like it's obviously a good and needed buff. It's just the whole deck is the problem, not just the capstone. Howderon Brightwing got a balance change that I said probably wouldn't be the change, because if he's going to be buffed to read, give all arcane spells in your hand and deck spell damage +1, then why isn't Black Rock and Roll receiving the same treatment? And I've come to the following assessment: this is a test run for Black Rock and Roll. Because realistically, Black Rock and Roll, part of the reason it feels terrible, is because now your deck is draw order dependent and it can't be fixed. You can draw your Trench Stalkers and your Decimator Olgas before Black Rock and Roll, and suddenly the minions you're doubling don't actually win the game. So that's a big part of why Black Rock and Roll feels bad. The same way if you've drawn a bunch of arcane spells already, this guy felt bad. My only guess is they thought Black Rock and Roll affecting minions in hand would be too strong. So this is sort of like a test drive for that change, because I have not seen a single competent Black Rock and Roll deck. It and Light Show to me are the two glaring absences for new cards and new win conditions that simply don't work and aren't in the list of buffs. And I view this change as the change that Black Rock needed, so I'm sort of viewing this as like a test drive to see how much impact this change really has in a different archetype they're not as worried about. But yeah, unambiguously a good change. This is just tremendously better than the old version of the card. The Jazz Base and the Record Scratcher, when we get to it, are both up to 3 attack, and I was thinking that maybe they'd go up to 3 durability like the Druid weapon, because like the Druid weapon, you really want to sit on them for an extra turn to charge up their effect, unlike the other weapons where very often you want either be down to 1 immediately to threaten using it, or just use it as fast as possible. But 3 attack is a much better tool for controlling the board, so it's still an unambiguous and fantastic buff. I was wondering if it might be a different one. I was wrong. Altered Chord surprised me, it just deals 1 more damage now. I thought it would go down to Death Strike cost, but it actually just went up to Death Strike damage, which is not actually very helpful. When I was talking about Flow Rider, I did come to the conclusion that I think the only buff you can really give this card is to reimagine it as a pushed 1-drop. Unfortunately, they just reimagined it as a normal 1-drop. I can't imagine putting this in my deck even less than putting the previous version in my deck. It's a 1 health minion, and we just had a balance patch where all the core minions that had 1 health got buffed to 2 health. This is just basically unplayable versus several classes. And again, it's not actually a 1-drop, it's still not playable on 1. You're not going to play 1 mana 2/1 Naga and be like, yes, got it, that's what I needed. It's, if anything, I think this is an even worse card than it used to be. I don't even view this as a buff. I'm trying to imagine this going into a deck, and I don't know what deck wants this. Especially because all the overload stuff that currently exists is a leaning towards controls, and making this a offensively statted 1-drop doesn't really make sense. If ever like a 1/3, much like the new Arcane Artificer, maybe, but this is a really aggressively statted minion that does nothing if you're not overloaded, so it does nothing if you play it on turn 1. Oh, it's so weird. I don't like new Flow Rider at all. I like it even less than old Flow Rider. Surprising, no one, Lightning Storm was finally down to overload 1, because, like, this is just barely better than Consecrate. It shouldn't cost 2 more mana. Crescendo is down to 2 mana, and to my surprise, Crazed Conductor is not going up to 5 attack or 6 health. It's becoming a 4 mana Spider Tank and getting the same effect. And I think that means that there's going to be a pretty reliable power spike on 4 where Crazed Conductor or Mischievous Imp is coming down on turn 4 pretty much every time. I hope Mischievous Imp is actually the name of the 4-drop imp. I always forget what he's called. It's an unambiguously better card, but I wonder if that actually really helps the curve of the deck that much. I'll be interested in looking at Imp Lock again since it has gotten some minor buffs, but I don't think they'll be too impactful all told. Siphon Soul is all the way down to 4 mana, just like Holy Nova, it's getting buff after buff after buff because we just can't make it playable. Now that it's on the same level as Twisted Tether, is that what it's called? Yeah, Twisted Tether. They'll at least see some play in decks without Undead, because previously 1 mana was more valuable than a 3 health heal, and that is no longer a decision. Now it's just are you Undead or not, so Siphon Soul should see some play now that it's all the way down to 4 mana. As said earlier, Record Scratcher up to 3 attack, unambiguous buff. Blingtron has been buffed to a 5/5. This means you can just slam Blingtron on curve in an aggressive deck and go face, and it's not a terrible play, right? It's essentially, assuming you have like 2 minions on board and Blingtron attacks next turn along with another minion, and you hit twice with the dagger. That's a 5-mana 5/5 Battlecry Fireball in the face. Now it's good enough that you can really easily justify putting it in an aggressive deck. I still don't think it's good. I still don't know what rogue deck exists that actually wants this, but now it's more of a, is this for Astalor combos, is this for aggressive decks? I don't see where its home is, as opposed to the card is just bad. Before it was the raw cost of Spider Tank and Weapon Hero Power, and that was terrible. So at least now it's worth the mana, as opposed to garbage. Holy Nova's down to 3 mana, and I guess just for the memes, it only hits enemy minions instead of face again. Can't wait for a few months or years from now, we make it hit face at 3 mana again. And then in 2026, when we power rep our current game to hell, we can buff it down to 2 mana and make it not hit face again. Carry Chosen Balloon is down to 3 mana, and if you're new to the game, when you look at this, you would never know this was buffed. Like, how on earth could this card have been printed with a worse stat line than that? And the answer is, yeah, it was printed a long time ago and it saw no play. So now at 3 mana, it's something you can actually consider putting in your deck, especially because it's not competing at the same mana cost as Rand. Well, except for Wild Growth, but most people end up cutting Wild Growth. So I do like Kyrie Chosen Balloon getting a buff, I'm just not convinced it'll see any play despite the buff. But I am convinced that it can see play now, whereas the old one just literally couldn't. Death Blossom Whomper got a buff that to me seems kind of random. I was going off the wall trying to figure out how they could buff this card to make it playable. Some people thought it would go down to a 4 mana 5/4. That seemed like a way to get it to work, because at 5 mana it competes with Flower Child and Nourish. There's too much going on at 5 for even going to 5 mana to be a meaningful buff. But it went to 5 mana and its stat line changed appropriately, and I don't think that actually helps the card. I think it could have been giving Taunt, but that changes the identity a lot. However, it does synergize with forcing them to get through the Death Rattle. I think it could have gone down to 4 mana and kept its identity. And I guess the fear is at 4 mana, like, is this just power creeping Amorphous Slime at that point? It could be. It's not, it's a fairly different effect, but it's still in line with what Amorphous Slime wants to do, except drawing instead of discarding is much, much better. However, you don't get the body. So I understand that the effect's very scary to put on lower and lower cost minions, but at 5, it's competing with literally everything Druid wants to do, and I can't imagine this gets played at 5. There's an argument that 5 cost cards are kind of good, because it means on turn 10, or rather on 10 mana, because Druid's not waiting until turn 10 to get there, you can play Death Blossom Whomper into Flower Child to trigger the finale. But I mean, finale just tends to not be hard to trigger in the first place. It hardly matters that it's easier now. It's just a 1 mana buff, and it's nice the card got the 1 mana buff and it didn't make it overpowered or anything, so there's no reason not to do it. But I don't think this makes it competitively viable. And we're down to Battleground, so we're done with the stuff that I actually care about. Of all the changes, I think only a couple really stand out to me as being really meaningful. Spitelash Siren seems like it might enable entirely new decks. Audio Splitter makes Mech Mage have a much better curve, although, as I mentioned on another card, a 2 health minion on your 2-drop is pretty sketchy with things like Sanguine Soldier running around and Disco Maul. It's a pretty bad Paladin matchup. Control Warrior got 3 1-mana buffs, so that has to have a meaningful impact, right? That has to help at least a little bit, with Shield Block down to 2, Bridge Rip down to 5, and First Rip down to 1. Surely that's enough to get Control Warrior at least on the map, right? I don't even know it's true though, because Control Warrior still does not have a clear win condition. Don't you fucking talk to me about Black Rock and Roll, I don't want to hear it. I guess Fires of Zinajari Tony combos haven't been nerfed and the tools around them have gotten a lot better. Yeah, you can play Tony Combo Warrior a little bit less memey now, it's an actual strategy. Maybe not a good one, but it's there now, unlike it used to be. It used to just be a meme because the control package didn't work and you're not playing when naturally Tony fires. So I think the whole package of Control Warrior buffs is really impactful. It's just that aside from Tony fires, I don't think a Control Warrior deck really exists right now, but Tony fires is a deck you can play. And as for the nerfs, I honestly think none of them are that impactful looking through them. All right, Twig's crazy impactful, it's not in my format. If I were a Wild player, I would be so happy to see this, because it is mandatory for that format to be healthy. However, as a standard player, this doesn't even affect me. And looking at the Frigidara nerf, like 5 attack's not the good part of Frigidara. That's not making Frost that much worse. Rowdy Fan still enabling anything enabled like eggs, it's still meaningful burn, it's just not as good. It definitely does receive a meaningful nerf and that does affect win rates. And then the Death Knight rune stuff, I think it mitigates a lot of the most disgusting high rolls. In particular, Frostburn's Fury never appears in Blood Now or in Unholy, and that's really appreciated. There's never a third Frostburn's Fury, that's really appreciated. So all of that the things it fixes feel really bad. But it also makes the discover pool more consistent, and not all of the things you're discovering for are 3 runes. If you're looking for 3 or 4 burn to face or low mana cost, those are low cost frost spells that don't have 3 runes. If you're looking for, say, a removal spell in general, like literally none of them have been removed, but 9 options total have been removed. Previously, if you played a lot of Death Knight, you're very familiar with, as an aggro player, seeing Vampiric Blood and Plagued Grain and being like, oh shit, I guess I picked the 3rd one. Both of those options are out now, right? It's not a clear nerf. It fixes the high rolls and it fixes the things that are the most frustrating, but it doesn't do it without drawback. There's no clean way to fix the Death Knight problem. And this is a good first step, but realistically, I think it's not going to be fixable until Blizzard just like makes an announcement with the mini set or the next expansion or a year down the line, where they're like, we're gonna print like 3 times more Death Knight cards than every other class, sorry. Because realistically, the only way to fix it is to limit it to your current rune selection, because they're different classes. Blood Discovering Frost cards is a Control Warrior Discovering Freeze Mage cards. Unholy Discovering Frost cards, just change it to Zoo Warlock Discovering Freeze Mage. And neither Zoo Warlock nor Freeze Mage should be able to discover Control Warrior cards in return. These runes are such different archetypes that they're much closer to different classes than different builds of the same class. Now that's fine, but since they can discover everything from each other, that means that the discover pool gets really, really difficult to play around and messy. And the only way to fix it is to make them not discover things that aren't in your current runes. But to do that without just buffing the pool requires each rune to have a class worth of support. Otherwise, when you discover blood cards, you're limited to just the shit blood wants. Frost cards is the same. Unholy cards is probably not a good thing. It's probably a nerf for Unholy, because Unholy does not have great spells. But these other 2 are just clearly buffed if you limit it to rune selection. And in my eyes, the only solution is to limit it to rune selection and print massively more cards for Death Knight so that each rune is legitimately its own class, and that requires dev time. That's not a thing anyone who doesn't play Death Knight wants to hear. So I don't know what a clean solution to this looks like. When they find one, it'll be a really impressive and elegant solution, and I think what they've done here is the best band-aid, but I don't think it's a clean fix. I think the problem will persist, but it is nice that the most disgusting of the high rolls has been fixed. Anyone who's ever seen turn 7 Frostwyrm's Fury into turn 8 Soul Stealer and lost the game, they're furious. It doesn't matter if they were fighting against a Blood or Frost, they were really unhappy. They'd be the most unhappy if they were fighting against Unholy, because that would be nonsense. But yeah, the high rolls are gone, it'll be less frustrating. I'm just not convinced it'll actually be that much worse on a statistical level, we'll have to say. On the whole, I don't think the meta will get shaken up too much from this, but it's nothing but steps in the right direction. I'm happy to see a big patch coming this quickly. There's not a single change that was made where I was like, they shouldn't have done that. Every single one of these is the sort of rapid, small, iterative changes that I love to see from the design team. It implies that they're actually watching and monitoring and making small, sensible changes rapidly. There's no more starving buzzard treatment, where we identify that one combo is the strongest thing a class has, and that class is the best, so we take it out behind the shed and nerf it by 3 mana with no compensation. So I'm happy with the patch. I'm worried that it won't change much, but that's okay, because with a new design philosophy, there'll be more patches. We don't have to hope that this patch fixes the game, because it's not the only patch we're getting this year. So I'm really happy with all the changes, and I'm hoping they're a little bit more impactful than I think they will be. Tony Fire Combo and Control Warrior might be legit now. I hope it is. I don't think it will be, but I hope it is. Anyway, that's it for now. I've been Incoherent. Hope you enjoyed hearing me talk about the patch. If you did, like, comment, subscribe. All that stuff really does help the channel grow. And I'll see you in the next one.